Shalom Aleichem. Today is Oreo Het B'Chislev, Toshin Pei Wow, according to our calendar, corresponding to 7th of December 2025, Leminyan Ha'umoth. On this page before you, this is not the only thing that we'll look at, I hope, this evening, but there are two separate quotes or sections from Rav Kook, Rabbeinu Agadol Rav Kook Zatzal. I wish to look at the second one, the one on the bottom of the page. This is from Kovetz Beth, Resh Ayin Beth. In other words, the collection of notebooks that was published, known as Shmona Kevasim. This is from the second of those Kevasim, which means it was written, I don't remember the exact years, but nearly 120 years ago. Rav Kook writes, "Acharei hamichraot haraboth she'anu ro'im b'darchei hayenu haklaliyim b'dorenu bichlal u'beretz Yisrael bifrat. Hinenu mukhrahim lahargish she'hinenu noladim mehadash." There's a certain young man, a neighbor of this household, who is unfortunately very unwell at the present time. His name is
Moshe ben Shlomit Hana.
Moshe ben
Shlomit Hana.
Moshe ben Shlomit Hana. This Shiur is being said as well as for all other possible reasons. Also, Shilo Nischuth and Refuah Shelema B'ezrat Hashem B'mehera V'yameinu. So this section, these paragraphs by Rav Kook here, the style already tells you that the opening sentence already tells you that this is written in the years shortly after Rav Kook arrived in Eretz Yisrael. Because you see, he's beginning to discuss immediately Darkei Hayenu Haklaliyim B'dorenu Bichlal U'Beretz Yisrael Bifrat. So Rav Kook is saying, when we examine our existence, our life as a Jewish nation, not as individuals, although that also is included, no doubt, in what we are about to say and what we are about to read, but more specifically, more particularly, when we examine our national public life, our national existence as the Jewish people in our generation. Again, this is being written roughly 120 years ago. And specifically in Eretz Yisrael, which is, again, the time, if you think back 120 years, Rav Kook arrived in Eretz Yisrael about nearly 122 years ago. It will be in several months, it will be 122 years. Torah Samach Dared, Kaf Het B'Iyar. Many people, and Rav Kook was one such person, felt that this is a new beginning for the Jewish people. Well, it certainly has the potential for being a new beginning, a new chapter in the life of Klal Yisrael. And we must address it in that fashion. We must think of it in those terms. And therefore, what does Rav Kook say? Hinenu mukhrahim lahargish. We must therefore, it's obvious that we must feel, we must think in these terms. We must feel and internalize this fact. Shehinenu noladim mehadash, that we are being born anew. As a nation, we are being born anew. That's what I said before, that this opening statement tells you immediately that these are the kinds of thoughts that were very much uppermost in Rav Kook's mind when he first arrived in Eretz Yisrael. And because we have someone here who's currently studying Machon Meir, I will state for the record that this is a section of Rav Kook that you will not be taught in Machon Meir. Even though, interestingly enough, this section appears in Sefer Oroth. It does appear in the handbook, as it were, of Rav Kook's writings, that the officially authorized and accepted authorized version of Rav Kook, because there are many parts of Rav Kook's writings that were deliberately suppressed by people in Merkaz Arav, by people in Machon Meir, etc., etc. Nevertheless, this particular section that we're reading appears in Sefer Oroth. I don't remember the exact page, but it's towards the end. And yet, I never heard it once. In my 10 years in Merkaz Arav, I never heard it discussed once. What exactly does this mean? What is he driving at? What are we supposed to make of this? Rav Kook continues, מתחתית המדרגה הננו הולכים ונוסרים עוד פעם כימים מקדם. We have arrived, we are returning to our land in a constant flow, a small but steady constant flow of Jews returning to Eretz Yisrael, and we must understand, and we certainly should try to utilize this new historic situation in order to redefine and reconstitute our existence. What does he mean? He says now explicitly and clearly what he means. Kol harechush haruhani shel ha'avar holech v'nivla'. All the huge body of intellectual and spiritual work, writings, teachings of the Jewish people, which any person who goes to any yeshiva or any Beth Knesset will see many books on the wall. Here in this room in which we are sitting, there are many books on the wall. If you go to your average home in the Western world today, you will not see any books on the wall, or you will see very few, if at all, if any. The Jewish people have at their disposal almost limitless, as Rav Kook calls it here, rechush ruhani, spiritual property, spiritual an inheritance, a legacy. And all of this, we have to view it as if it were, it's now being as well like a black hole. We're living now in a new time. There's a black hole which now is able to absorb and suck into itself all of that wealth of our Jewish spiritual legacy of the past. It's all lichora being nivla bimkoro, as it were, it is now being, it's returning to its source and it's being condensed. And it now is possible and should appear now, it should reappear in a new form. Befanim hadashot. Mekutanot harbe bechamuthan. This is a very interesting point. Smaller in terms of the quantity of all that tremendous legacy which the Jewish people studied and taught and created during the galuth, during the exile. All of that, in terms of quantity, should be now reconstituted in a concentrated form. So in terms of quantity, it's going to be less, but very, very robust and fresh and powerful, such that they will lead to great growth, new, renewed growth, hayim azizim be'echutam. In other words, in terms of the quality, we are in a situation where we can begin to envisage a time when the Torah, as we've lived it and as we've understood it and learnt it and taught it and written it and absorbed it for so many generations, is now going to be reconstituted and will now appear in a slightly, somewhat different and significantly different form. And therefore Rav Kook continues, and he says, Hinenu keruim la'atid hadash. We are called, we must understand that we are being called to and must prepare ourselves for a new future. La'atid hadash. Maleh zar elyon, which will be replete with spiritual enlightenment. Maleh zar elyon lithkufa hadasha, a new period in Jewish history. שתעלה בחוסנה על כל התקופות גדולות הערך שקדמו לה, which will be greater than all previous periods in our history. It's a very powerful statement. It's very hopeful. Some people would say, some people might claim that it's pretentious or just some kind of a pipe dream, or it's not clear what he's referring to. I would not think so. I would not say so. Rav Kook was of the view that it is possible, and I think it was possible at that time, but I think we dropped the ball. That's the problem. It was possible to pick up that ball and run with it at that time, and to use a sports metaphor, to score a try or a touchdown or whatever version of the game you play. It was possible, but if you drop the ball, of course, then the opportunity is lost, and you probably will have to wait a long time for another similar opportunity to present itself. And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in today. But nevertheless, this idea, this vision, has to be uppermost in our minds. Ma'aminhu ha'am kulo, all of that the Jewish people believe, she'en galuth od aharei ha'geula ha'olechet u'mutheleth lefanenu, that this return in our time to Eretz Yisrael, again 120 years ago roughly, is the beginning of a new chapter. There will not be another galuth, another exile in the future. ואמונתו העמוקה הזאת היא בעצמה רז קיומו היא. And it's because of this belief, this faith of the Jewish people, that is always what has kept it alive and motivated. And so we believe today as well, that we are at the beginning of a tekufa hadasha, as Rav Kook wrote, and that this period will be the beginning of a period of geula, of redemption. He speaks about a geula ha'olechet u'muthhelet lefanenu, that has begun, that has been, as it were, set in motion. That's the translation of the word muthhelet. It's been set in motion. So that Hashem nigla b'malacho ha'histori. We see here Hashem's hashgacha, hidden hashgacha, which is working within history. وَهَمَّسَرَتْ هَعَثِكَا مِعِدَا al-or nishmatho, and all our ancient traditions testify to the great spiritual powers and capabilities of the Jewish people. وَهَمَّكَرَتْ et asma وَذْ كَلَ يِحُسِّم شَلَ هَمَّأُرَأُثْ شَلَ عَبْدُرَ حَرَونَ. And the Jewish people is aware and recognizes these facts and its relationship to current events as they were then. Dor Sofel Yeshua Kurova, a generation that looks forward to redemption in the foreseeable future. So Rav Kook wrote all those years ago. Am I right that you never heard that in Machon Shilo?
It sounds like something that you've heard from Rav Kook. I don't see why particularly they would be wanting to avoid this. It seems to be...
I can tell you, I think exactly why, and I think they would very studiously avoid it.
Yeshivas, so
Okay, no, but I'll tell you why I think they would avoid it. Although, as I say, it's strange, because it does appear in Sefer Oroth, which is the most standard handbook that Rav Tzvida published and edited and told people to study. But it's talking about Atid Hadash, a new future. It's talking about a Tekufa Hadasha, a new period in Jewish history. It's talking about somehow taking all the Rechusha Ruhani, all that spiritual knowledge and wisdom and energy and power and all that legacy, and somehow reworking it and reconstituting it in a new form. All right, so that's a very great challenge that's just been thrown down before you. What are you going to do? How are you going to reconstitute? What are you going to reconstitute? What are you going to be aiming for if you even contemplate this reconstitution for a moment? I think that, and I'm not going to mince my words here, this is what Rav Kook thought and wanted and dreamt of at that time. It's what I believe we should all be thinking of and dreaming of at this time as well. But I don't think that's how the people who came to be in charge of Rav Kook's yeshiva, Yeshivat Merkaz Harav in Yerushalayim, which was set up exactly 100 years ago. I don't think that was, these ideas were understood and certainly not digested, and certainly not, there were the people involved were not able to, if they saw and took note of this message, of these words, I don't think they had any idea, frankly, how to go about making it into a reality. And I think they were scared of making it into a reality. I would say even petrified.
But they really actually opposed it.
I'm about to say, I think you're right. I think that, and I said I'm not going to mince my words, I think that Rav Kook, Rav Kook's son, was, I would say, even petrified of these ideas. He certainly never gave any expression to these kinds of ideas. You didn't see, and you don't. I have never seen. I've never heard of any such redefinition, reconstitution, reassessment of all of Torah Yisrael from previous generations being somehow reassessed, reworked, etc., and restated in a new way in these generations. I've never heard anything of that sort at all discussed in my 10 years in Merkaz Harav Yeshiva. And I think that was not by accident. I think that was because I mentioned Rav Kook, and there were others as well. I think they were very, very wary of such talk, because they immediately, or they were concerned that some people would immediately accuse them of reform Judaism, or something like that, which is of course the furthest thing from Rav Kook's mind. But take into account, it's the same Rav Kook who elsewhere, around the same period of time, or a few years before, or a year or two after, but around this period, 120 odd years ago, wrote that in the future, he said, I think he wrote, I think I quoted this at some point in the past, I haven't got it here to quote to you. I think it appears in the second volume of Osrot HaRaya that Mori Rav Moshe Tzoriel Zitzal published. There Rav Kook expresses himself to the effect that in the future, I think the Mishneh Torah of Rambam will be the central halachic handbook and text that will be used by Chachamim in future generations. That's also a fairly courageous statement, which is not exactly in line with what was then current practice and what is still perhaps current practice. But Rav Kook did think in those terms. He was thinking in those terms, and this is one of the reasons, for example, that Rav Kook led the way in writing a Biur on part of Biur Hagra on the Shulchan Aruch. He began this on Hoshem Mishpat. And what he showed there was, he didn't complete the project, but he showed that this is possible and it's necessary to, just as the Gra wrote Be'ur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch, in order to, and this is not my interpretation, this is what his Talmid, Hagon Rabbeinu Chaim Volozhin, writes explicitly in his Hakdamat to Be'ur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch, Torah Hayim. Rabbeinu Chaim Volozhin writes that the Gra wrote his Be'ur on the Be'ur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch in order to connect once again those two things that had been, the connection had been lost. Some disconnection and some separation had occurred between the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara, the Talmud, the sources of Chazal and the Rishonim. So people would be, in the time of the Gra, it was common and still is common for people to study the Shulchan Aruch and not to study the primary sources. And the Gra thought this was completely wrong, and it's not something that should be countenanced or accepted. And in order to redress this situation and to make that, take that unsatisfactory situation and rectify it, he wrote the Be'ur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch. So says Reb Chaim Volozhin. Because the Ikar, says Reb Chaim Volozhin over there, is not what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. The Ikar is what it says in Chazal. And the Shulchan Aruch is a way just to do Chazara and to refresh your memory of the basic halachot, not to forget, etc. That's also what the Beth Yosef meant when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, that you should go over the entire Shulchan Aruch every 30 days. He writes this. Without Perushim, without any additions, without the Ramah even, but that's what he thought. This is just a book to people to do Shinun halachot, Shoneh halachot. Kol ha-Shoneh halachot b'chol yom, etc. So that was their Shoneh halachot. But we know that's not how things worked out for various reasons. So the Gra wrote Be'ur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Kook wrote a Be'ur on Be'ur HaGra to the Shulchan Aruch, not on all of it. He began such a project, and people then got the idea that this is something we need to do. So others then moved forward with the same idea. Did the same for Even Ha'ezer and parts of Even Ezra. Others did it on most of our Hayim. We have a Biur on Be'ur HaGra on the Shulchan Aruch, etc. His name was Rav Rakover, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But really, what Rav Kook is doing here in this section, this brief section, is throwing a gauntlet on the ground before us and saying, this is what needs to happen. This is where we should be going. And Rav Kook was very hopeful that something of this, along these lines, would begin to develop. It did not develop at that time, and I would say it still is in its very early infancy. But it certainly has not developed and will not develop. This is the other point that needs to be made. It did not develop in, shall we say, Yeshivat Merkaz Rav of even in Rav Kook's day, although Rav Kook was only alive for 10 years after the yeshiva was established. Then in the following years after that, Rav Kook passed away in THWARTED 1935, Leminyanam. And from those years down to the present, things haven't changed. In some ways, I would say they got worse. I can tell you, for example, that so if we talk about limud halacha, for example, or limud Gemara, Rishonim and Halacha, because it's all one miktzah, it's all one thing, as we just said. So it's not only the Gra who thought so, Rav Kook also thought so. Rav Kook describes in detail in a number of places, and one of those places is in a talk that Rav Kook gave in the early years of Yeshivat Merkaz Rav, called Sa'af HaRav, which appears at the end of Oroth HaTorah, in which he describes in general terms how he thinks that Talmidim should study Gemara and Halacha in the yeshiva. So when I first arrived in Yeshivat Merkaz Rav, I began to look at these sources, and I asked myself a very simple question. How come this yeshiva doesn't do anything, any of these things that it says in all these sources? Clearly Rav Kook thought this is what should be going on in this yeshiva. Why is this not happening? Why is the shiurim not at all along the lines that I'm looking at as I see here? I went with this very question. I myself, a brash, young inexperienced. How old was I at the time? 18 or 19. I went to a Gaon Rav of Ram Shapira Zatzal, and I asked him that question. Why don't we have a shiur, at least, if not all the shiurim, why don't we have one shiur at least, for those who want to study Torah, as Rav Kook himself describes, as the Gra said, and I mentioned also the Maharal says the same thing. It's nothing new, it's nothing, all the Rishonim learned Torah in this way. There's nothing revolutionary about this. Strangely enough, Rav Shapira's response to me was Chas v'Shalom. Those are the words. I was stunned, but that's what he said to me, and he never changed his mind apparently. He said, no, Chas v'Shalom, absolutely not. When I tried to understand why, I did not receive any cogent answer.
Where did Rav Kook fall on this issue?
Well, it's clear that Moreh Rav Gafech Zatzal was very much rooted in Mishnat Rambam, that's clear. But obviously he thought that studying the Talmud with the original sources, with the major Rishonim, Geonim, Rif, Rambam, Rosh, etc., was the correct thing to do. How could he think again? Who doesn't think so? To give the name of one Gadol B'Yisrael who doesn't think that's how it should be done. Essentially, there's a teshuvah, a famous teshuvah of the Khatam Sofer, where someone writes him a question, asks him something about Sefer Tanya, the Baal Tanya. His response is, I'm not familiar with this book, and I haven't got time for all kinds of books written nowadays. I barely have time to study Shas and Rishonim. That's what he writes. And he wrote the same thing to someone else. He wrote that roughly the same words in two places. I've seen it in two different teshuvot of the Khatam Sofer. Halawa yaspik hazman lilmod Shas v'Rishonim. So I can tell you, I know for a fact that in Yeshivat Merkaz Rav then and today, what Rav Kook had in mind was not implemented, nor is it done, as far as I know, in any yeshiva. At least I'm not familiar with such a thing. Maybe it's going on somewhere, maybe, hopefully it is, but I'm unfamiliar with this fact, if it is so. And it's something new, to me, at least. But implicit in what Rav Kook writes here is a message which it's implicit. Maybe it's not explicit, but it's certainly implicit, and that is that it's time to reassess and to change how things are done, and to think and work differently. And as I say, when he specifically addresses how to study Torah, in his yeshiva, he speaks even in more explicit and specific terms. In another place in Orot HaTorah, Rav Kook writes, for example, that it's necessary for Talmidei Chachamim, once they got some mileage under their belts and they have a good grasp of how to study Talmud and Rishonim, what they need to do is to, first of all, achieve a hekef yedi'ah hekefith of the Torah Shebaal Peh, which he says is not very difficult if you do it the right way. That's what he writes. Well, at least not as difficult as some people might think. He says the way to go about it, he says, Rav Kook writes explicitly, is that such a person who wishes to become a real chacham should concentrate on studying Hilchot Harif, with the one or two mefarshim on the Rif as necessary, to cover which is a sikum of the Torah Shebaal Peh, of the Talmud Bavli and certain other sources, here and there certain quotes from the Talmud Yerushalmi as well. And it's a sikum of the Talmud, and with the Psak Halacha. It's not the only opinion, but it's certainly a major opinion, and it's more often than not also the opinion of the Rambam. And that is the first thing to do. And once you've done that, he says, which is not so difficult and won't take forever, then mimela a person will have the desire to look into all the sugyot more be'iyun in their original form in the Talmud with other Rishonim, etc. And that is the suggestion that Rav Kook makes explicitly, which is printed in Orot HaTorah, again printed by Rav Kook. But if you ask me, have you ever heard of anyone in those circles actually doing such a thing? My answer to you would be, to the best of my knowledge, absolutely not. Why? It's a very good question. That's the question I asked also that time I told you, and I did not get an answer. Which is why, in my particular case, I can say quite honestly, without fear of contradiction, that I myself learned very little from the yeshiva, from being in that yeshiva for 10 years. It was just a place to be from my point of view. I learned myself. Basically everything I know I taught myself. I stopped going to shiurim in the middle or towards the end of the winter in Shiur Beth. I said that I had enough, and I decided it wasn't worth the time or the effort, and I began to study entirely by myself. And then I met someone else who saw things in a similar way, and we began to study together. That's what we did for many years. We studied together.
Even from Rav Kook?
No, Rav Kook wasn't in the yeshiva. He was as an external. That's outsourcing.
I thought he was part of the staff then.
No. Moria Rav Kook Zetzal was a young Talmid in Yeshivat Mekaz Harav. If you go back decades before I arrived in Mekaz Harav. In other words, I'm not sure exactly in what year Rabbi Yosef Gafech arrived in Eretz Yisrael. I don't remember exactly, but I think we're talking about the 40s. No, maybe it was already in the 30s. Well, at any rate, certainly in the 40s, he was there, the Minyanam, in the last century. And he, for example, relates how Rav Kook was very Rav Kook was very much in favor of Sefer HaKuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Levi being studied in the yeshiva, seriously. Rav Kook himself gave some shiurim, as Rav Kook himself mentions in a couple of places, that I gave some shiurim in the yeshiva on Kuzari. He writes this. But it was his Talmid, Harav Nazir, Rav David Kohen, who more or less took over that role of giving regular shiurim in the Sefer HaKuzari, which he did for many years.
There are volumes of that.
Yes, there are.
Volumes have been produced.
Yes, there are 3 volumes, I believe, of He'arot and Perushim, which are basically the summary of the shiurim that he gave over a period of many years, which were later published by I think Professor, I think his name is Dov Schwartz, perhaps. And Rav Kook relates in a few places how he used to attend these shiurim, and that the Nazir would ask him, and Rav Kook had a copy of the original Arabic in which the Kuzari was written. He would ask him, because the Nazir was working with the Tfus Rishon and the Targum of Ibn Tibon, which he specified that if these shiurim that I'm giving or these notes of mine are published, I want to be published with that text, which is how it was published. But it's not always entirely correct and perfect. And he used to ask Rav Kook sometimes, because he understood the Arabic, what does it say in the Ktav Yad or the original, because he had such a text in front of him. So Rav Kook was in favor of studying Sefer HaKuzari very seriously, and the Nazir did this for many years in the yeshiva. The Nazir also wrote up a curriculum, a Tochnit Limudim, for the yeshiva at Rav Kook's request. And we have this exact curriculum that he wrote up, very involved. It's a multi-year curriculum. If you took a look at it, you would you would likely need to sit down and to absorb what the Nazir thought a student should cover in a number of years in the yeshiva. The Nazir writes in his own hand in the book that we have from the Nazir called Nazir Ehal, which was put out after the Nazir passed away in Toshin Lamed Beth, 3-volume set, in which he published that curriculum there is published, and he also says that when I showed this curriculum that I wrote at Rav Kook's request to the Rav said to me, were I to have written the program, this is exactly how I would have written it. Okay, well, I don't need to tell you that none of that was ever implemented either. In other words, what I'm just telling you is that the yeshiva known as Merkaz HaRav, as it was then way back, going back 100 years and 90 years and 80 years, and going back to when I arrived in Merkaz HaRav, which was in Tavshin Lamed Het, 1978, Levinyanam. That yeshiva, in practical, in real world terms, did very little to implement that which Rav Kook envisaged and wanted. And I most definitely think that this is not by accident, but this is the way Rav Tzvita wanted it or planned that things should be. I don't think he saw eye to eye with that curriculum at all, and he did not indicate to people or suggest to people they should learn in even Gemara, even Halakha in such a fashion. And I think that's a great tragedy. And I would tell you further that the current, there's a new iteration, as it were, supposedly, of Rav Kook, and that's you have what's called Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav today. As you may know, there was a split in Yeshivat Merkaz HaRav many years ago. I don't remember the exact year, but we're talking about I think nearly 40 years, but something 35 years certainly. So there's another yeshiva today called Haramor. And I think it's a very close race between these two yeshivot, which is further from Rav Kook's idea of how the yeshiva should run, and what it should look like, and what should be taught, and what should be understood, and what should be practiced. They both go off at a tangent, completely off the derech, I would say, completely off the derech, and which I think is a terrible tragedy. But don't let anyone tell you, this is my view. Some people obviously will disagree, and that's okay. Everyone's allowed to have their opinion, or at least people think they're allowed to have an opinion, so I can't prevent them from saying otherwise, even if I think they're completely wrong, even if I can prove they're completely wrong. Neither of these yeshivot, and none of the other yeshivot that have devolved from these two yeshivot, in the one case, those connected to Haramor called themselves Yeshivot HaKav, because they've developed a kav, a line, a philosophy, which is basically a reiteration of Rav Tzvita by Rav Tzvi Tau, which is even further off the derech, in my view. Let no one tell you that they are teaching what Rav Kook had in mind. That's simply not true. 100% not true. Not even when it comes to halakha. Not even when it comes to halakha, limud Talmud, Rishonim, halakha, nor in terms of Agada, Machshava, Jewish philosophy, whatever it is. I think all of these institutions, all of them, no matter how many times they take Rav Kook's name in vain, I think they are completely off the derech. They don't represent what Rav Kook had in mind at all. So all of this, to my mind, is tragic, but it needs to be said. It so happens that I recently became aware of certain younger people in their 20s and 30s, expressing various criticisms of Yeshivot HaKav, Rav Tau, and Haramor, etc., etc. And I would agree with many of those criticisms. I would also point out that one of the major things that they omit to mention in this article that I saw is that it's not some aberration that just didn't happen by chance. Rav Kook was clearly not a continuation of his father. He was something else, which is fine. Everyone's allowed to do their own thing, to be their own man, to think what they want to think, but then tell me this is what you think and not what so-and-so thought. That's okay. But if you deliberately suppress some of Rav Kook's writings and edit others of his writings without telling me that you're changing the text, which they did, and we know this for a fact because we have the original today, well then you know that they're not a true representation of what Rav Kook had in mind, and that's something that we need to on the one hand bemoan, on the other hand be familiar with and aware of, and then the third thing we need to do is to decide what does need to be done, what should be done. But it's not what is being done, it's something different. What needs to be done in order to somehow bring into the real world the kinds of ideas that Rav Kook mentioned here that we read before, something different is required. Something very different. And that is still waiting to happen.
I was wondering, in your mind, which kind of group of people is picking up the mantle of, let's say, Rav Kook? Because out of the young generation, you have in the settlements, you have the Hilltop Youth, which kind of split into followers of Breslov and just, I don't know, more spiritual, more, they are also learning.
I wish I could tell you. I hear your question, and I think all of us ask ourselves the same question all the time. And I wish I had an answer. I don't think I have an answer. But I suppose the answer has to be that we know that, historically speaking, most things in history take time. There's a process that things develop, sometimes over years, sometimes over many years, sometimes over generations, sometimes perhaps even over centuries. And you can trace these things. That's what real historians do. And that's why history is a valuable and important study. So I cannot tell you what will be tomorrow, what will be in 10 or 20 years from now, but I think that I will say, and I said before also that I will, earlier in the Shiur I said that I will not mince my words. I will say as follows. What used to be the flagship of the Dati Leumi world in yeshiva terms, Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, which was then the split occurred, and then Yeshivat Haramor, and then you have all these various yeshivot affiliated with either of these two, mainly with the latter, yeshiva. I think all of that will collapse. I think that essentially already Yeshivat Merkaz Harav is fairly irrelevant. When was the last time you heard of any important person or book emerging from that yeshiva? I can't remember such a thing, frankly. I can't remember a single serious book emerging from that yeshiva in all the years I can recall. Now, dafka from the other side of the split, there are books, but if you're willing to read them, you will discover that they're not worth reading. They're light-headed, sometimes even childish. Certainly not serious scholarship of any kind. Just dogmatic, ideological parroting of what they heard from someone else over and over again, regurgitated time and again. There's nothing there. It's a crazy system of Hasidut that has developed around Rav Tal and around Rav Kook, etc. But I think all this is a bubble that is already bursting and will certainly burst in the future. Where all the pieces will fall when that bubble bursts, I don't know. But something new, something different has to emerge, and I believe B'ezrat Hashem will emerge. And the kinds of things that we talk about in these shiurim, for example, are some of the ideas that I think will form the underpinning and the foundation of such a movement, or at least will form part of the foundation of such a movement.